Yeah, well, in 1949, the Soviet Union convened a peace conference in New York City called the Waldorf Peace Conference. And it was just this amazing conference. And Albert Einstein was there, and the composer Aaron Copland was there, and a lot of Hollywood stars were there. And they were all saying that the Soviet Union was right in the Cold War and that the USA was wrong. And it was just a huge, amazing conference. And this was at the height of McCarthyism. And the CIA looked at that conference and they were just furious about it. And you can read, if you go to the CIA website, cia.gov, you can read about what they did in response to the Waldorf Peace Conference of 1949. Is they launched the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which the CIA considers to be one of its most successful programs, the CCF. And they hired a New York City Trotskyist named Sidney Hook, a college professor who actually thought he was a Marxist, but he was like a Trotskyite professor in New York City. And they hired him to run this program for the CIA called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And the CIA brags about this. And what they did is they tried to create distance between Western intellectuals who might become communists and the Soviet Union. And the program, they did a lot to distort left-wing ideology and left-wing thinking in the United States and Western Europe. For example, they promoted the work of Jackson Pollock, the painter, right? The Soviet Union was promoting socialist realism, art that showed the plight of working people and struggles for justice and promoted a socialist message. Well, the CIA began funding the work of Jackson Pollock, who just splattered paint on a canvas, right? And the idea was, look, it's free. It's not propaganda, right? It's just free. And that's, they funded a Trotskyite magazine called the Partisan Review magazine. And they made sure this was on every campus. It was everywhere. And it had the writings of George Orwell. It had the writings of Susan Sontag. It had the writings of Noam Chomsky in it. And it was left-wing ideas that were critical of the Soviet Union. They were critical of the United States, but they were also critical of socialism, also critical of Marxism. And if you read some of Susan Sontag's essays, where she talks about notes on camp and other things, she basically argues that any form of ideology is itself oppressive. Later in her life, Susan Sontag very famously said that communism is nothing but the most successful form of fascism. That's actually a direct quote from her, right? What does that even mean, right? But if you read her essays on the fascist aesthetic and all of that, she hates socialist realism and she hates Marxism because Marxism says there is actual truth in the world. Everything's not a matter of opinion, right? That there is actual truth and reality, that there is good and bad in the world, there is right and wrong. The postmodern left that emerged with CIA assistance was basically arguing that there was no such thing. Everything's a shade of gray, everything's a matter of opinion, and anyone who comes along and says, look, let's try to work toward a goal, let's have an ideal, they're a totalitarian, they're oppressive, and that kind of thinking became synonymous with leftism.
Yeah.
Drugs in particular, right? Drugs are something that the left has always struggled against, right?
Yeah.
I mean, after the Chinese Revolution, the execution of heroin dealers and heroin importers was very massive. They executed a lot of them because the British Empire had used heroin and opium to control the Chinese people and make them like slaves, basically. And that's, and then when the emperor had tried to ban bringing opium into China, they'd waged the two opium wars, where the British sent the Navy to force the Chinese to allow narcotics from Britain to flow into the country, right? So they executed all kinds of drug dealers, and then the drug addiction was seen as something that was a disease of capitalism, right? It's that people are suffering, they turn to drugs as a way to try to ease their pain, and that it's a horrific thing, and that when people become addicts, their life is destroyed, and every last cent is going to the drug, and it's just a horrendous thing. Well, the CIA started a program in the 1950s called MK Ultra, and it was a program where they began distributing drugs on college campuses. You can read about this, and they would go to college campuses and they would do little experiments where they would give college kids LSD, and they would, it blew their mind. And then there was Dr. Timothy Leary, who was a Harvard professor who'd been involved in these LSD experiments, which were very quietly linked to the CIA. And he actually started touring the United States, and he got fired from Harvard, and then all over the United States, he was traveling around and going to talk to young people who believed in protesting the Vietnam War and believed in the civil rights movement, and telling them the way to be revolutionary was to do drugs, right? And you can read about Dr. Timothy Leary, and it was all about use LSD, use marijuana, and he had this slogan, tune in, turn on, and drop out. And a lot of the literature that came out of the 1960s left was actually very anti-Soviet, right? And it said, that because the Soviet Union, they're a bunch of squares, they're not cool. It's a new revolution where we're hip and we just do our own thing and we listen to rock music. That was all very carefully created by big record companies and by the U.S. intelligence agencies. I mean, Woodstock, for example, the Woodstock concert that everyone talks about. The musicians were all flown to Woodstock. They were flown in to the concert on military helicopters, right? So the establishment, it's not like Woodstock was just a random concert that happened in the middle of the woods, right? I mean, military helicopters were involved. Big record companies sat down and planned the whole thing. The 60s counterculture was very much a creation of the Western capitalist system, right? I know it wasn't all a big conspiracy. We know like the Nixon wing of the establishment was very opposed to it. But it was very, very carefully crafted. Another thing was the Eastern cults, for example. The Dalai Lama, he is loved in leftist circles, right? If you go to liberal and leftist circles, people love the Dalai Lama. He's Eastern, he's mystical, he's, but if you look at it, the Dalai Lama, when he was running Tibet, it was an awful feudal regime in which people had no rights, in which they had public executions and people having their eyes gouged out for speaking critically of the Dalai Lama and mutilations. And it was just an awful thing. And in the 1950s, the CIA, enabled the Dalai Lama's brother to be airdropped into Tibet, and they fomented, a whole big civil war. The Tibetan Civil War. You can read a book published by the Heritage Foundation that's called The CIA's Secret War in Tibet. And it describes how Tibetans were trained in Colorado and then airdropped into Tibet to engage in guerrilla warfare against the Chinese government, against the Chinese Communist Party. And it was basically the Contra War of Ronald Reagan. It was Nicaragua, except it was in the 1950s and it was in Asia. The Tibetan movement, the Tibetan separatist movement, has always been a right-wing movement to overthrow communism and to reimpose serfdom and feudalism into Tibet. However, the Dalai Lama was brought to the United States, and he's Eastern, and he's mystical, and now in Hollywood and in leftist circles, people idealize this very, very right-wing movement. And in fact, the book 7 Years in Tibet, which is considered like a holy book among people who love the Dalai Lama, it's this memoir of this German guy who goes to Tibet, and it's so amazing. Well, it was written, the author of it is Heinrich Harrer, and he was a member of Hitler's SS, actually, at the time he wrote it. That's why he was in Tibet. And Julius Evola, the main ideologue of Italian fascism, also loved Tibet. And he loved it because there was no protests and there was no strikes, right? And that the caste system of India, for example, right? That all these Indian gurus, guys from India, who are Hindu nationalists and believe in the caste system, they tend to be celebrated in left-wing circles as well, right? The Hare Krishna movement. If you go to India, communists hate those people. They're considered the most far right-wing guys around. They want to kill all the Muslims. They don't believe in protests and strikes. They believe that, if you're poor, well, then you should just live a good, humble life, and then maybe you'll be reincarnated into a rich person in their next life, right? That's the idea. I mean, they're very, very right-wing. They're opposed to any kind of socialism or class struggle. They're very, very authoritarian. But yet in the USA, in left-wing circles, they're welcomed in and they're seen as, wow, they're Eastern and they're mystical and they're going to help you have inner peace. So a lot of things that are considered to be right-wing around the world are now considered to be left-wing in the United States. And I think that distortion of leftism has a lot to do with why people identify with leftism, with being sloppy and screwed up and addicted to drugs and all of that.